Picture this. The Keth Mori have been living their best life for 3,000 years. We're talking floating crystal cities above gas giants, spending their days creating art and solving impossible math problems. These guys were so peaceful, they probably apologized to asteroids to get in their way. Let me paint you a picture of what the Keth Mori civilization actually looked like. Imagine the most beautiful city you've ever seen, then make it float in the clouds of Jupiter. These crystal structures weren't just pretty, they sang in the solar winds. Literally sang. The Keth Mori had figured out how to make their buildings create music from cosmic radiation. Their children grew up listening to symphonies that most species couldn't even detect. These weren't warriors or conquerors. The Keth Mori spent their mornings painting with light itself, creating artworks that existed in 17 different dimensions. Their afternoons? Solving mathematical equations that would make Einstein weep with joy. They had scientists who treated physics like poetry and poets who found beauty in quantum mechanics. War wasn't just foreign to them. The concept was so alien, they didn't even have a proper word for it in their language. Their society was built around something they called the Great Harmony. Every decision was made by consensus. Every voice mattered. They had debates that lasted decades, not because they were stubborn, but because they genuinely wanted to hear every perspective. Crime was virtually non-existent, because why would anyone want to hurt someone else? Violence was something they'd read about in ancient historical texts, like a disease they'd evolved past. The Keth Mori had contact with other peaceful species across the galaxy. They traded knowledge, shared discoveries, held interstellar art festivals that lasted for months. The universe, as far as they knew, was filled with civilized beings who solved problems with discussion and cooperation. Sure, there were rumors of aggressive species out there somewhere, but those were just stories, myths, things that happened to other people in distant corners of space. Then the Devourers showed up. Think space locusts, but worse, way worse. These chitinous nightmares were basically a hive-minded plague that ate entire worlds for breakfast. The first sign something was wrong came from the outer colonies. Communication simply stopped. Not damage or garbled, just silence. When the Keth Mori sent investigation ships, they found nothing. No ruins, no debris, no trace that billions of beings had ever existed there. The Devourers weren't just destroying worlds. They were consuming them. Everything. The planets themselves were being stripped down to their cores, converted into some kind of biomatter that fed the swarm. These creatures didn't negotiate, didn't communicate, didn't show mercy. They existed for one purpose: to devour everything in their path and grow stronger. Within weeks, 17 Keth Mori worlds had vanished. Billions of peaceful beings, thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, countless works of art that had taken centuries to create, all gone. The survivors described creatures that looked like nightmares crossed with industrial machinery, living ships that pulsed with organic weaponry, soldiers that moved like a single organism, coordinated by some terrifying collective intelligence. The Keth Mori Council convened for the first time in living memory to address an actual crisis. These beings who had spent millennia perfecting the art of peaceful discussion suddenly had to figure out how to fight something that couldn't be reasoned with. They had no weapons beyond basic tools. Their security forces were essentially sophisticated crossing guards. Their mighty fleet was designed for exploration and research, not combat. So what did the Keth Mori do? They sent out the most polite distress call in galactic history. Greetings to all civilized species. Their message began: "We are the Keth Mori of the Crystal Reaches. We face an unprecedented threat and humbly request assistance from any beings who value peace, knowledge, and the preservation of culture." The transmission went on for hours, describing their society, their achievements, their willingness to share everything they knew with anyone who would help them. They offered technological exchanges, cultural partnerships, access to their greatest libraries. They painted themselves as valuable allies worth saving, beings who could contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. They expected diplomats, maybe some fancy peacekeeping force, representatives from the great galactic councils they'd heard about, scientists and scholars who would appreciate what the Keth Mori had to offer. Surely someone out there would see the value in preserving such a peaceful, advanced civilization. You know what they got instead? a beat-up human warship that looked like it'd been through a blender, crewed by the kind of people that made other humans nervous. The ship that answered their call didn't even bother with proper identification protocols. It just appeared in their system one day, broadcasting a simple message. "We got your distress signal. We're here to handle your Devourer problem." Meet Captain Jack Morrison. This guy had been court-martialed so many times. The military just gave up and shipped him to the edge of nowhere. His crew? Handpicked from the worst military prisons Earth had to offer. These weren't your average soldiers. These were the ones who scared other soldiers. Let me tell you about Jack Morrison's record. The man had been written up for everything from insubordination to creative interpretation of the rules of engagement. His first court-martial happened when he was just a lieutenant. He'd ignored direct orders to retreat and instead led his squad on what he called a tactical reorganization of enemy positions. Translation: he got bored during a siege and decided to end early. It worked, but his superiors weren't exactly thrilled about the unauthorized fireworks show that followed. Court-martial number 2 came 3 years later. Morrison had been tasked with escorting diplomats to a peace negotiation. Halfway through the meeting, he figured out the other side was planning an ambush. Instead of following protocol and reporting to command, he quietly repositioned his entire security detail. When the shooting started, his people were ready. The diplomats lived. The treaty got signed, and Morrison got another formal reprimand for exceeding his authority. By court-martial number 5, the military brass realized they had a problem. Morrison was too good at his job to discharge, but too unpredictable to promote. He had a talent for turning impossible situations into victories, but he did it in ways that made lawyers nervous and politicians wake up in cold sweats. His crew was cut from similar cloth. Lieutenant Kate Brooks had been serving time for weapons modification charges. Apparently, she'd gotten creative with standard-issue equipment and turned a maintenance laser into something that could cut through battle armor. The military court called it reckless endangerment. Her squad called it the best upgrade ever. Sergeant Mike Torres was doing his sentence for what the paperwork politely called aggressive interrogation techniques. The real story was that he'd gotten information out of captured enemy agents using nothing but psychological pressure and an unsettling smile. No physical harm, but somehow his methods were so effective they made experienced interrogators uncomfortable. Then there was Corporal Danny White, who'd been locked up for starting an unauthorized war. Well, technically it was a police action, but White had taken a patrol into disputed territory and convinced 3 different rebel factions to stop shooting at Earth forces and start shooting at each other instead. Problem solved. Region pacified. But apparently you're supposed to get permission before redesigning local political structures. These people weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They were soldiers who saw problems and fixed them, usually without waiting for someone in an office somewhere to give them permission. Earth's military had tried everything: therapy, retraining, desk jobs, even early retirement. Nothing worked. These individuals were born for conflict, and peacetime made them restless. When Earth's government intercepted that alien SOS, they saw a golden opportunity. Why risk their good, respectable military when they could send the troublemakers? Kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? The decision went all the way up to the top. Some bureaucrat in an expensive suit looked at Morrison's file and saw the perfect solution. Here was a crew of effective soldiers who couldn't follow orders, being asked to handle a situation where following orders probably wouldn't work anyway. The Devourers didn't sound like the type of enemy you could defeat with proper military procedure. So off they went, 8 months in deep space, turning their ship into something that would make nightmares file complaint. The journey to Kethmori space became their preparation time, and these people prepared like their lives depended on it. Lieutenant Kate Brooks spent her time modifying weapons that were already illegal in 3-star systems. She took standard plasma rifles and somehow made them more efficient, more accurate, and significantly more intimidating. Her workshop became a place where the impossible happened daily. Need a device that could cut through alien bioarmor? Give her a week. Want something that could disable enemy communications? She'd have 3 different options ready by Tuesday. Sergeant Mike Torres carved personal messages into ammunition. Each round was a work of art, inscribed with phrases in 12 different languages. Some were jokes, Some were threats. Some were philosophical observations about the nature of warfare. He said it was about psychological impact, but everyone knew he just enjoyed the craftsmanship. The entire crew threw themselves into studying the Devourers like they were planning the world's most violent thesis project. They analyzed every scrap of data, every transmission, every report from worlds that had managed to escape. They learned the enemy's movement patterns, their breeding cycles, their feeding habits. They figured out weak points in bioship construction and identified gaps in swarm coordination. By the time they reached Kethmori space, Morrison's crew had transformed both themselves and their ship into something designed for one purpose, making the Devourers regret every life choice that had led them to this particular corner of the galaxy. The Kethmori got their first look at salvation during the worst possible moment, right in the middle of a Devourer assault on their capital world. They're watching their beautiful crystal spires getting torn apart, expecting some shiny rescue fleet to show up with formal greetings and proper military procedure. The attack had been going on for 6 hours. The Kethmori's most sacred city, New Harmony, was being systematically dismantled by creatures that moved like living machinery. The crystal towers that had sung in the solar winds for centuries were being cracked open and harvested. Millions of civilians were evacuating through tunnels that had never been designed for this kind of emergency. Elder Zephaniel stood in the emergency command center, watching readouts that showed their pathetic defensive capabilities being overwhelmed. Their security forces were brave but completely outmatched. Ships designed for research and exploration were trying to engage biovessels built specifically for war. It was like watching artists try to fight professional soldiers with paintbrushes. The Kethmori had been tracking the Devourer fleet's approach for days, sending increasingly desperate updates to anyone who might be listening. Their long-range sensors showed the true scope of what was coming, not just a raiding party, but a full harvesting swarm. Hundreds of organic ships, each one pulsing with alien life and bristling with biological weapons. Any response to our distress signals? Zephaniel asked his communication officer. Nothing from the Galactic Council. The Vordak Empire says they're considering our request. The Peaceful Alliance is still debating whether intervention would violate their non-aggression principles. In other words, they were on their own. The Kethmori faced extinction, while bureaucrats held meetings about the proper procedures for providing aid. That's when the human ship appeared. Instead, this scarred human ship drops out of hyperspace and immediately rams straight into the enemy swarm. No warning shots. No demands for surrender. Just pure, calculated violence. The vessel that materialized in their system looked like it had been through several wars and enjoyed every minute of it. Scorch marks covered its hull. Sections had been rebuilt with different metals, giving it a patchwork appearance. It wasn't sleek or beautiful like the ships in Kethmori design philosophy. It was functional, brutal, and somehow intimidating just by existing. The Kethmori expected proper first contact protocols, maybe a formal introduction, credentials verification, strategic planning meetings. They prepared translators and diplomats, ready to brief their rescuers on Devourer tactics and defensive positions. Instead, the human ship accelerated directly into the thickest part of the swarm and started a fight. The first Devourer bioship that moved to intercept exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The humans had somehow weaponized their own ship's drive system, turning their arrival into an attack. But that was just the opening move. What happened next defied everything the Kethmori understood about civilized warfare. The human vessel began moving through a Devourer formation like it belonged there, firing weapons that seemed designed to cause maximum chaos rather than efficient elimination. They weren't trying to destroy the enemy fleet. They were trying to terrify it. The humans fought like the Devourers had personally insulted their mothers. Captain Morrison's people were jumping between ships and spacesuits, planting explosives with the casual efficiency of someone doing yard work. The Kethmori could hear them over the comm channels, actually laughing while they turned bioships into fireworks. Elder Zephaniel listened to the human communications with growing amazement and horror. These beings were treating the most dangerous threat the Kethmori had ever faced like it was some kind of recreational activity. Torres, you seeing this? That big one's trying to regenerate its armor. Yeah, I got something for that. Brooks, you got any of those special rounds left? Always. Want the ones with the pretty lights or the ones that make the weird sounds. Dealer's choice. Make it memorable. The Keth Mori watched through their sensors as human soldiers in powered armor moved from ship to ship through open space, using some kind of magnetic grappling system to traverse the battle zone. They moved with precision, but also with an enthusiasm that bordered on madness. When they encountered Devourer boarding parties, the humans didn't retreat or call for backup. They seemed genuinely excited about the challenge. Lieutenant Kate Brooks was apparently some kind of weapon specialist, because every few minutes another Devourer ship would light up in ways that physics textbooks said shouldn't be possible. Her modifications weren't just effective, they were artistic. Each explosion was different, creating patterns of light that were almost beautiful if you ignored what was causing them. Sergeant Mike Torres seemed to be everywhere at once, coordinating ground operations while personally handling what he called attitude adjustments for any Devourers who got too close to civilian evacuation routes. His running commentary over the comm channels mixed tactical updates with what sounded like personal observations about enemy fighting techniques. But it was Captain Morrison who truly amazed the Keth Mori. This human was commanding the battle like he'd been preparing for this specific fight his entire life. He anticipated Devourer movements, exploited weaknesses in their formation, and somehow managed to be inspiring and terrifying at the same time. The contrast was stunning. Here were the Keth Mori, one of the most advanced civilizations in known space, being rescued by beings who treated warfare like it was their natural habitat. For 6 straight days, it was like watching a masterclass in organized chaos. These humans hunted Devourer nest ships through asteroid fields like they were playing the galaxy's deadliest game of hide-and-seek. They used gas giant storms as cover, turned the planet's own weather into a weapon. Day 1 had been the initial shock, watching the humans arrive and immediately start a fight that should have gotten them killed. But Day 2 was when the Keth Mori realized they weren't just witnessing a battle. They were watching artists at work, and their chosen medium happened to be warfare. Captain Morrison had studied the local system during their approach, and he'd apparently seen possibilities that the Keth Mori had never considered. The asteroid belt that surrounded their capital world wasn't just a navigation hazard. It was a 3-dimensional maze perfect for ambush tactics. The gas giant storm systems weren't just weather. They were electromagnetic interference that could hide entire fleets. The human crew started hunting Devourer nest ships through those asteroid fields like they'd been born in zero gravity. These nest ships were massive things, each one capable of spawning thousands of smaller attack vessels. The Keth Mori had tried to engage them directly and failed miserably. The humans took a different approach entirely. Lieutenant Brooks had figured out that Devourer bioships relied heavily on sensory feedback from their organic hulls. So she started using the asteroids themselves as weapons, not by throwing them, but by creating what she called sensory dead zones. She'd planned devices that mimicked the electromagnetic signature of empty space, making large asteroids essentially invisible to Devourer sensors. The result was like watching a nature documentary about predators, except the predators were flying spaceships. Human fighters would chase nest ships into the asteroid field, then vanish. The Devourers would follow, confident in their superior numbers, only to slam full speed into rocks they never saw coming. Morrison's people weren't just fighting, they were setting traps. But the real masterpiece came on Day 3, when they started using the gas giant storms as cover. The planet's atmospheric disturbances created electromagnetic chaos that disrupted most forms of communication and targeting systems. The Keth Mori had always avoided those areas during conflicts because they made coordination impossible. The humans loved it. Sergeant Torres had somehow figured out how to navigate by reading the storm patterns themselves. His squad would disappear into the atmospheric interference, then emerge at exactly the right moment to hit Devourer formations from completely unexpected angles. It was like they'd turned the planet's own weather into a cloaking device. The Keth Mori monitoring stations picked up fragments of human communications during these storm raids. Torres would be giving tactical updates while simultaneously providing what sounded like meteorological commentary. Enemy formation bearing 270. Looks like a breeding cluster. Storm front should hit in about 4 minutes. Winds picking up to about 300 kilometers per hour. Perfect weather for a surprise party. These humans were using 100 km/h winds as tactical advantages. They calculated how the atmospheric disturbances affected different types of ships and weaponry, then planned their attacks accordingly. When Devourer bioships tried to follow them into the storms, the organic hulls couldn't handle the electromagnetic interference. Human technology, apparently, was built to work in conditions that would disable most other civilizations' equipment. And when things got really bad, when they were outnumbered and outgunned, they'd ram their own shuttles into enemy ships while singing old Earth war songs. The Keth Mori didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. The first time it happened, Elder Zethanael thought it was a malfunction. A human shuttle pilot had been cut off from the main force, surrounded by Devourer fighters. The logical response would have been to retreat or call for backup. Instead, the pilot accelerated directly toward the largest enemy vessel while broadcasting what sounded like music over all frequencies. The song was in an Earth language, the Keth Mori translation. Computers identified as English. Something about glory and death and going down fighting. The shuttle pilot was singing along while manually overriding his ship's safety systems to turn the entire vessel into a guided missile. It worked. The Devourer's ship's organic armor couldn't handle the concentrated energy released from a small ship's reactor going critical at point-blank range. But what disturbed the Keth Mori was that the human had sounded genuinely happy about the whole thing. This wasn't desperation. This was enthusiasm. By day 5, the Devourers were starting to retreat. These creatures that had consumed 17 worlds were being systematically outfought by a single human ship and its crew of apparent madmen. The swarm intelligence that controlled them seemed to be having trouble processing opponents who treated certain death as a tactical option. By day 6, the remaining Devourers were fleeing the system. But here's the kicker. The humans had carved messages into the hull of the last ship before letting it go. Warnings in a dozen languages, basically saying, tell your friends what happens when you mess with our new neighbors. Lieutenant Brooks had used some kind of precision cutting tool to inscribe text directly into the bioship's hull. Not just human languages, but Keth Mori script and apparently several other galactic scripts the humans had picked up somewhere. The message was simple but effective. Protected by Earth, find easier prey. The psychological impact was perfect. Let one ship escape to spread the word. Make sure every Devourer hive in the sector knew that the Keth Mori now had protectors who considered interstellar warfare a recreational activity. The humans had turned military doctrine into performance art, and somehow it worked. When the smoke cleared and Captain Morrison sat down with the Keth Mori Council in their pristine crystal meeting hall, the aliens finally understood what they'd summoned. These humans spoke politely about casualty reports and supply logistics, but you could see it in their eyes. They were already planning the next hunt. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Here was the most sacred chamber in Keth Mori civilization. Walls made of living crystal that hummed with harmonic frequencies, floors that reflected the light of distant stars, furniture grown rather than built from materials that sang when touched. Everything in this room represented 3 millennia of peaceful evolution, artistic achievement, and philosophical advancement. And sitting at their conference table was Captain Jack Morrison, a man whose uniform still smelled like smoke and whose boots left scuff marks on their perfect crystal floors. The meeting started the way you'd expect any diplomatic encounter to begin. Elder Zeno offered formal thanks for their rescue, speaking in a flowery, elaborate style that Keth Mori used for important occasions. He talked about eternal gratitude, cultural exchange, and the bonds of friendship between their species. Morrison listened politely, nodded at appropriate moments, and then asked, so, where did they come from originally? That wasn't the response the Keth Mori had prepared for. They'd expect a discussion about trade agreements, maybe some formal alliance ceremony. Instead, this human was already thinking about the next phase of operations. Lieutenant Brooks spread out star charts on their beautiful crystal table, pointing to potential Devourer breeding grounds. Sergeant Torres was calculating supply lines and fuel requirements for extended operations in deep space. These humans had just finished saving an entire civilization, and they were already planning their next deployment. The thing is, Morrison explained, you can't just fight the symptoms. Those Devourers didn't evolve in your sector. They came from somewhere else, which means there's a source, a home base, maybe multiple home bases. The Keth Council exchanged glances. They'd been thinking about rebuilding, about healing, about returning to their peaceful way of life. The humans were thinking about taking the war to the enemy's doorstep. Elder Zethanael tried to steer the conversation toward more civilized topics. Perhaps we could discuss cultural exchanges? Our scientists would be honored to share their research with Earth. That's great, Morrison replied. We'll definitely want your censored data from the attacks. Help us build better profiles of their ship types, movement patterns, breeding cycles. The more we know about how they operate, the more effective we can be at hunting them down. Every response came back to warfare. The Keth would mention art, and the humans would ask about defensive applications. They'd bring up philosophy, and the humans would want to know about psychological warfare implications. It wasn't that Morrison and his crew were being rude. They were genuinely interested in Keth culture. They just processed everything through a military lens. The real eye-opener came when Corporal Danny White started asking about other species in the sector, not for diplomatic contact, but for intelligence gathering. Which civilizations had been attacked? Which ones had survived? What defensive measures had worked or failed? You're building a target list, Elder Zethanael realized. We're building a hunting ground, Morrison corrected. These devourers are going to keep expanding until someone stops them permanently. That someone might as well be us. The Keth had asked for protectors and gotten predators instead. Earth hadn't sent their heroes to answer that distress call. They'd sent their demons, and those demons had unfinished business with a fleeing enemy. The conversation that followed revealed the true nature of human military thinking. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were problem solvers who happened to specialize in violent solutions. They looked at the devourer threat and saw not just an enemy to defeat, but a puzzle to solve, a challenge to overcome, a hunt to complete. Lieutenant Brooks explained their modifications to capture devourer technology. She was already working on ways to track their biosignatures across interstellar distances. Sergeant Torres had ideas about psychological warfare, ways to disrupt hive-mind coordination, using targeted electromagnetic interference. These humans were thinking several moves ahead in a game the Keth didn't even realize they were playing. As the human ships departed, following the devourer trail back to wherever these things came from, the Council realized something chilling. Sometimes the only thing more terrifying than monsters is the species that breeds individuals capable of hunting those monsters to extinction. The humans left behind a small communication relay and a promise to check back periodically, not because they particularly needed Keth support, but because they wanted intelligence updates. The Keth system had become part of their operational area now, a forward observation post in their expanding war against the Devourers. Elder Zethanael stood in the crystal chamber after the humans had gone, listening to the harmonic frequencies that had once brought him peace. Now those same sounds reminded him of human weapon signatures, of the strange music their ships made when charging their drives for hyperspace jumps. They were safe. Their civilization would survive and rebuild. But they were also connected now to something vast and dangerous, a species that turned warfare into art and found purpose in the spaces between stars where civilized beings feared to go. The Plea had gone out across the stars, and Earth had responded, just not what the angels of Keth had hoped for. And somehow, that was exactly what the galaxy needed.